The rope was cutting into her wrists. It smelled of wet leaves and smoke and something metallic she couldn't name. Old blood, perhaps, or the taste of fear lodged like iron at the back of her tongue. She had counted the knots until her fingers went numb. She had imagined the blade, the shout, the final stomp of boots. She had practiced the shape of death until it fit her like clothing. Boots came closer, heavy steps, not gentle. A shadow fell across her eyes. Her breath tightened. For a moment the world shrank to the rough rope, the tree bark scraping her back, and the sound of boot soles crushing the forest floor. She waited for the scream. Then a hand, foreign in smell, weakly of soap and tobacco, slid under the frayed rope and cut it. The blade flashed. The rope split. Warmth poured back into her wrists in a rush, as if life itself had been pinched and released. She did not lurch away. Her body did not obey. She kept waiting. That was what the training, the pamphlets, the sermons, and the posters had carved into her. When the enemy reaches you, it is for one purpose. The enemy did not bring water. The enemy did not bring chocolate. The enemy did not bend low and ask, in a voice that was small and careful and wholly human, "Are you hurt? Can you drink?" She did not know his words. She was not sure she heard them clearly. The tone carried what the words might have promised. She drank. August 1945. The war, which had been a distant thunder for the first years, had become an immediate, grinding force. A machine that chewed not only soldiers, but lives, names, cities. Ayumi Tanaka had been 18 and then 19. She had been a daughter and a niece, and most recently, a fugitive hiding in a cave she had once visited as a child to pick shiitake on the slopes outside the village. Now she was a woman who had learned to count boots by their cadence, who had learned where to sleep so her breath would not show, who had slept through explosions and the desperate calls for suicide by ritual, by poison, by fire, told to avoid shame, to spare the family the disgrace of capture. Her sister, Yuki, had chosen the river. Ayumi still felt the memory as if it were lodged in her jaw. Yuki's last laugh turned thin and watery, the way the night swallowed her whole. Ayumi had not stopped her. She had not been brave or selfless. She had been afraid, and in that fear she ran. The guilt rode her like a shadow. The propaganda had been relentless. Leaflets dropped from planes, loudspeakers blaring that the enemy would rape and mutilate, that they were devils in uniforms, that capture meant humiliation and torture, and that death at your own hand was the hero's final kindness. These words had been hammered into children in assemblies, printed on broadsheets bound to trees, recited by neighbors who had become preachers of panic. Ayumi had learned them, believed them, carried them like a talisman that kept her alive and, in the same breath, condemned her to a life of tremors. So when the rope came off, and the blade glinted, and a face leaned close, hands steady, sleeves rolled, eyes not red with hatred, but green and wet with something like worry, she expected the knife. She expected the final performance the propaganda had scripted in her head. Instead, she tasted cold water and bitterness of black chocolate, and the breath in front of her said in an accent she didn't know, but that felt like an old language of kindness, "Easy, we won't hurt you." In the minutes that strung out after that first offering, the world did strange calculus. The soldier's jacket hung with dirt. His face had a thin scar across the cheek, like a line someone had tried to erase. He did not look triumphant. He looked tired. He was young. His breath smelled faintly of gum. He introduced himself in broken syllables she could not always catch. "Jim," he said once, and his name landed in the cave like a small, bewildering truth. She had been taught to name him monster. Instead, she found a human who blinked, who flinched at the echo of a shell, who moved with the gentle impatience of someone who had lived through too much and wanted to give what he could. A towel laced with the scent of soap, a square of tinned chocolate passed with the hesitance of a man offering more than food, offering a possibility. He did not demand she speak. He did not force a confession. He helped her to her feet. It was at that moment, the dull thud of his boot on the stone at the cave mouth, that Ayumi felt the old conviction break like a thin glass. Not gone, not erased, but hairline fractures had appeared in the armor of every hate she'd been taught, and the light slipped through those cracks. After the ropes and water and chocolate, the world kept making new noises. Voices from beyond the cave mouth. Orders barked in clipped English. A sergeant, stern, older, the shape of discipline, moved with purpose, his badge glinting in the sputtering light. He asked for names. He asked for the situation. The cave breathed with whispers, women discussing, refusing to be counted, clinging to old rituals even as new ones were forced upon them. In a language woven from fear and habit, they clutched at silence. Ayumi's feet remembered the path back to the village, to the hillside where she sewn attachments into garments for luck. Those memories felt like another person's life. Pre-war festivals, the smell of soy, the scrape of geisha clogs, Yuki's laugh. They were treasures she had abandoned like toys. Now there was a man called Jim and a woman called Kiko, who kept pressing her hand or pressing food to her lips in a manner that was neither patronizing nor distant. Kiko had been a teacher, older by a dozen years, and her voice had a small, steady flame. She would not, she said once, allow Ayumi to shoulder the burden of Yuki alone. The American sergeant, Sarge, the soldiers called him in that muffled way that made titles into small rough things, did not ask about honor or shame. He did not offer judgment. He catalogued what he could. 7 women, 3 children maybe, a handful of rice sacks, a few guns covered in cobwebbed shame. He radioed a request: medical assistance, transport to an evac point, food. Ayumi could not understand all the words. She did not need to. The gestures were declarative. The tone was not that of a predator. It was bureaucratic, efficient, human in the blunt way institutions can be. The Sarge barked. Men moved. A medic, Captain Reynolds, later introduced in halting syllables, came with a white armband and a bag that smelled of liniment. He asked questions about wounds, recorded things in a little book like a priest noting confessions, except colder, more mechanical. He assessed, he bandaged, he distributed sulfa and something that might be candy. The practicalities coexisted with the fragility. Antiseptic and awkward apologies worn the same way. If the immediate danger had been physical, if the rope had been meant to hold her for an execution, the more devastating thing was the possibility of betrayal, that these gestures of care were bait. Death, for Ayumi, was no longer only the knife. It had been offered in smiles, in promises of an afterlife, in exhortations to die honorably. To accept kindness meant admitting she had been wrong. To refuse it would be to maintain an illusion that might save her conscience, but not her body. When Private James Jim Morrison knelt to cut the rope, he had no script beyond the one embedded in soldiers everywhere: save what you can. He had been stationed in a packet of America's advance, a young man from a place the women in the cave could not name without it becoming a story. He had never imagined he would be part of a rescue. He had imagined being shot, or freezing, or returning home smelling like other men's fear. He had not imagined quiet, startled faces, or a woman who tasted the water and then, 2 breaths later, spit it out because she could not be sure it wasn't poisoned. She looked like she'd swallowed the sea, he told the sergeant later, voice low. He had green eyes. He had fingers that still vibrated with the memory of cutting rope. He had offered chocolate because they had been taught to carry rations for civilians. The rations in his pocket had become a simple currency that altered destiny. Ayumi watched him and catalogued him. Green eyes, cigarette-smoked laugh lines, an accent she could not place. And yet, in that cataloging, in that attempt to reduce the complexity to something she could understand and control, she felt the most dangerous thing: the stirrings of trust seed themselves. The other women emerged from the darker crannies like pale moths. There was Sachiko, with the hollow of pregnancy visible and a way of cradling her belly as if sheltering a small secret son. There was Hannah, young, only 16, who had bandaged a sprained ankle for another woman and then learned how to set bones. Hannah had eyes that flickered between fury and care, like a small lamp that threw too much light in the wrong direction. Fumiko, older, walked with a stiffness that the soldiers later called recovered knee. Noriko, stoic and quiet, said nothing at first. Keiko spoke softly, but when she spoke, people listened. She had been a teacher and had the habit of making sense out of chaos. They were all arranged in a rough arc near the cave's mouth. Their faces, hardened, shock-softened, reflected something the propaganda had never allowed: confusion, curiosity, fear, and most uncannily, relief that sometimes looked like the tentative first steps of laughter. The soldiers did not parade their presence as a victory. They moved with a practicality honed by months on the front: water, bandages, a census list. Some of them were young, jittery, and polite. Others were older, eyes rimmed with smoke and the steady glaze of duty. Captain Reynolds, when he saw Sachiko, moved without hesitation, clean hands and practiced calm. He had to pronounce the obvious: needs a doctor, needs shelter, and then set about arranging it. He wrote names phonetically. He gave Tylenol and dextrose. He offered a paper cup and a tiny blanket with a civilian's pity disguised as necessity. Ayumi's body remembered how to be suspicious. Every kind word had to be weighed against 1,000 rumors. There had been stories, some true, some grotesque, because rumor feeds on fear, of men in uniforms promising salvation and delivering violation instead. The propagandists had used every grotesque possibility to turn fear into obedience. Ayumi had met those stories with the same blind terror that made her prefer death. And yet, a soldier had put a warm towel to her cheek. A boy, Jim, had torn off a small square of chocolate and held it out to her like an offering he did not believe would be accepted. She took it. It tasted of sugar and a foreign economy and something like hope. When she ate the chocolate, the cramped place inside her chest eased marginally. The small gesture, ridiculously small, reconfigured her memory. The edge of the cliff at which she had been standing slid back. She could now imagine a moment beyond waiting for a blade. After the immediate surrenders and the first orders, there was the quiet business of decision-making. The soldiers could not leave civilians in caves indefinitely. There were airlifts and transport and the risk of counterattacks. Someone had to guide them to the other hidden people. Someone had to name those still inside the valley. Ayumi held her breath. Her body, still skittish with fear, felt heavier with the weight of the decision. The women looked to her because she had been the one who had sheltered them, who had shared the place and the food and the small rituals that kept people from dissolving. Ayumi had no intention of betraying the cave, but she also had no desire to see those faces outside vanish into reprisals, or to see pregnant women and the elderly left unassisted. The logic of self-preservation tangled with a new, stranger impulse, the need to survive together. Survival, she understood, could be communal or it could be solitary. Both had a moral calculus she did not want to solve. She spoke haltingly, words spilling that were half her old language and half phrases she'd learned in the hush of fear. She told them the path she'd taken to the second pine, the stone marked with lichen, the back trail that bypassed the old rice terraces. She gave directions by touches on the ground and folding her fingers to mimic a goat trail. The soldiers listened, eyes flicking between her and the cave mouth. One of them, Jim, kept his hand near his pistol, not in readiness for violence, but as if the gesture anchored him to caution. They set out at dusk the following day. The forest at dusk is loud in a way daylight never allows. Insects held in a vibrating symphony, the slow rot of leaves, a distant river like a low drum. The soldiers moved in a line, disciplined, boots in cadence. Ayumi walked between them and the path, small in her own memory, yet monumental in the consequence of what she carried. Knowledge of safe routes, knowledge of the people who had trusted her, and the possibility of a future that might not be only blame and guilt. As they walked, the landscape told a story of collapse. Burnt houses like blackened teeth, charred rice fields where the season had failed, a shrine toppled and half submerged in a mire of mud. Yet between the ruins, life clung stubbornly. Green shoots pushing through ash, a persimmon tree with fruit stubbornly orange in the gray. The contrast was jarring. The present was a debris field. The future, if there was one, felt like the green shoots, fragile but insistent. The approaching sound of their footsteps alerted more than the enemy might. At one bend in the trail, a man stepped out of the brush. He had a rifle slung, and his clothes hung on him like another skin. He looked exhausted, but not hostile. He bowed, a movement ingrained and automatic, then motioned to the soldiers with a small, careful sweep of his hand. He spoke in Japanese, and the Sarge listened, brow furrowed. The man, the name later transcribed as Indefinido, spoke of other caves, of people hiding near the eastern stream. He carried a note of desperation that matched Ayumi's own. Sometimes the smallest kindnesses attract the largest dangers. The group moved on. At the second pine, where the trail narrowed and the forest closed in like curtains, the soldiers slowed. They crouched like animals, reading the ground, broken twigs, footprints, a torn scrap of cloth. Ayumi felt the old story of fear creep back. Her palms sweated on the strap of her satchel. She had decided to show them the way, and now every rustle might be a trap. She measured the distance between herself and the soldier to her left, Jim, who moved with a soldier's economy, but whose every look betrayed a nervous concern. When they reached the mouth of the second cave, Ayumi's heart hammered loud enough she thought horns would sound in her ears. Breath from inside met them, thin, human, the kind that did not belong to a monster. A small child's sob, then silence. The Sarge gestured, and two soldiers moved forward, helmets low, hands ready. Jim hung back a beat, meeting Ayumi's eyes. He mouthed something, probably ready, but what he meant she could not know. So she stepped. She stepped into the mouth of the cave and into the fold of all she had protected. The interior was dim and smelled of smoke and illness and the sweet tang of preserved plums. Faces turned. A woman with gray hair who had been clutching a rosary stared like a deer caught in car headlights. Children peered from behind shoulders. Eyes regarded the soldiers with suspicion, some hope, some pure bewilderment. Ayumi felt the weight of each gaze. She had invited the soldiers in, and the act had gravity. It meant bargaining with fate. It meant hoping that a person could redefine a narrative that had been hammered into a population by fear and propaganda. Private Morrison moved first. He kept his hands open, palms visible, an instinctive sign language of peace. He handed out what little they had, A thermos of water, pieces of chocolate wrapped in paper that had flown over continents and become an implausible luxury. Keiko cried quietly when she tasted the water. Sachiko's fingers clutched at the fabric of her dress. Hannah, though, had already moved to help, taking a blanket and laying it over a small child. Her hands were quick, practical. Trauma had taught her how to translate fear into work. Nobody made proclamations. Nobody claimed the moral high ground. The soldiers did what they could. The women accepted what they needed. The moment was thin and exquisite. Ayumi watched Jim as he knelt by a small girl who had taken ill. He spoke softly in English, and the girl shook her head because the words were foreign. But the cadence of the man's voice calmed her. He pressed a finger to his own lips and then to the child's forehead, a motion that needed no translation. It would be easy to sketch the scene as a simple moral, that kindness proved propaganda wrong. But Ayumi's soul was not reduced to a single ledger. She felt gratitude and suspicion at once. She felt the slowness of her trust building like a scar. Visible, lasting, a reminder that something once sharp had been dulled but never fully healed. When the soldiers left, they promised to return with a vehicle. They spoke into radios that crackled with static and the urgency of logistics. They said things such as evac and medical, words that carried a bureaucratic music. The Sarge pinned a small paper with a scribbled name on the cave wall. He held a small flashlight to Ayumi's face and said, plainly, "Keep them here." It was an order. It was a covenant of sorts. Ayumi closed the cave mouth behind them and, for the first time in weeks, she sat and allowed herself to feel the tremors subside. The muscles in her shoulders, forever knotted, stretched like a rope reborn. She felt the absurdity of a single action, accepting chocolate, rippling outward to alter lives. That night, under a sky that had been unmarked with the puncture of aerial searchlights, the women gathered. They spoke in small clusters about things that seemed impossibly mundane in the face of everything. The quality of the water, the texture of the cloth, the smell of a foreign brand of soap. Keiko showed them how to fold bandages to make them more efficient. Hannah taught a child to hold a spoon without burning his tongue. Sachiko hummed a lullaby to the small daughter of a family who had been found in a nearby ditch, a lullaby that was more ritual than melody. Ayumi lay awake, listening. Her hands went to her wrists, searching for the marks of the rope as if they might have returned overnight. She mapped the new contours of her life in small things. A tin of chocolate hidden in a corner, the way Jim's shadow had crossed the cave mouth, the cadence of the soldiers' boots as they faded back down the trail. She thought of Yuki and of the river that had taken her, and of the different choices people make when they are taught to believe in one story only. Morning came, and with it the practicalities of survival. The soldiers returned, 2 vehicles this time, canvas backs flapping in the wind. They had brought supplies, canned food stamped with foreign letters, blankets, boxes of sulfa and penicillin that smelled medicinal and miraculous. A medic assigned to the unit began to speak in a more measured voice, teaching the women basic hygiene, how to treat small wounds, how to keep water from stagnating. Captain Reynolds had a way of making instructions sound like a lifeline. He addressed the women directly even when translation was clumsy, and he moved among them like someone who had learned to carry both purpose and patience. Ayumi helped where she could. She learned how to wrap a wound properly. She learned how to hold a bowl without scalding herself on the new hot tins the soldiers had set to simmer. She learned the value of small, steady tasks as antidotes to frantic fear. Each action reminded her that life could be built again from small bricks. But the presence of the soldiers also carried contradictions. Men in uniform could be rescuers today and perpetrators tomorrow, stories insisted. The Sarge himself sometimes wore a face that could not decide between sympathy and suspicion. He interrogated quietly, taking names, dates, stories. He asked whether there had been any collaborators, whether there were weapons hidden in the caves. Ayumi answered, because she could not afford to lie and because she wanted to be useful in a world that had started to feel dangerously chaotic. The other women reacted in different ways. Keiko was outwardly pragmatic. She coordinated with the medics. Sachiko consumed the food with a desperate gratitude, as if each bite were a small, urgent salvation for the infant life inside her. Hannah, though younger, took to watching the medics with a keen interest that would later become a vocation. She began to learn to bind limbs, to clean wounds, to comfort with a steady hand. Still, the question of return lingered like a persistent scent. Would they go back to the ruined village? Where would they fit in a Japan that had been transformed into a rubble pit? Would they be blamed for survival? Would they be welcomed, or would neighbors who had stayed behind eye them as if they had committed treason by living? These questions made the mornings sharp with anxiety. Private Morrison's presence off and on threaded through these scenes. He was not a constant hero in dresses of simplicity. He was a man who moved through awkwardness, who apologized with a lift of his hands when he could not find the right words. He laughed poorly at the jokes he did not fully understand. He listened, though sometimes only with a look that said he was thinking of something else. The letters he had left home, the person waiting whose name he could not speak aloud. At one point, Ayumi found him sitting alone on a rock, peeling the wrapper from another piece of chocolate, as if to make a ritual of it. She sat down beside him without making a sound. "You speak," he said haltingly. He pointed to her and then to himself, the staccato grammar of two people trying to bridge a language gulf. "Ayumi," she said, and then realized the name might mean little to him, tucked as it was into a world he did not know. He repeated the name the way someone repeats a fine word in a foreign tongue until it comes to feel less strange. Ayumi. Then he pointed to himself. "James," he said. "Jim." The two names hung between them like a pact. No history, no ideology, just two small identities offered and received. "Jim," she repeated, and the sound of it was like a small breaking open. She found herself telling him how the rope had cut her, how the chocolate had tasted like thunder. He listened with that soldier's stillness that is sometimes the only discipline left when the rest of the world is chaotic. He did not promise heaven. He did not explain the war. He gave her the practical gift of a quiet presence. That evening, a radio crackled to life with a different kind of order. The Sarge gathered the women and, as best as translation allowed, announced that they could be moved to a field camp where civilians were being triaged, fed, and where arrangements for repatriation would be coordinated. It was not a temple of hope, only a functional space with blankets and ration cards. But it was a step. Ayumi trembled at the notion of walking back into a world with names again. The cave had been a womb of survival. The camp would be a city of new expectations. She imagined trains and trucks and the chance to stand among other faces that might mirror her own pain. She felt, under that imagining, a small flare of fear. What if the soldiers who brought them away were not the only kind of soldiers? What if the future carried other dangers she could not foresee? She lay awake that night and thought of her sister by the river. She thought, selfishly, of herself. The prospect of leaving the cave set a barrage of memories in motion. The taste of rice and strawberries in childhood. The sash clutched at festivals. A school uniform line of girls who had once sung in a choir and now would not be singing at all. She felt both gratitude and a stubborn private rage at being taught to be afraid of a green-eyed man who had handed her water. In the dark, she rehearsed the question she would ask soldiers and medics and any polite stranger she met in the days to come. Why did they tell us we were to expect monsters? Who had thought it right to carve everyone into enemies so they might be easier to kill? The answers were not going to fit in a single night. The convoy came at dawn. The canvas trucks were both terrifying and miraculous. They smelled of oil and leather. Soldiers loaded blankets and bundled women into narrow spaces where the air tasted like hope and dirt. Jim helped carry Sachiko carefully, 2 soldiers on either side like awkward midwives. Keiko took charge of a trembling child. Hannah made sure the elderly were strapped with warmth. Ayumi climbed into the truck and looked back once, searching the pattern of the forest for the shape of the cave she had tended like a secret garden. When the vehicle started, the motion made her stomach lurch but also steadied something else inside her. The forest receded. The ruined landscape unfurled like an old map she was finally allowed to read. She pressed her palms to the wood and felt the thrum of the engine and the weight of many hearts beating together. As they rolled toward the place the soldiers called the field hospital, Ayumi thought of the moment that had torn a seam in her taut certainty, the cutting of the rope. It was a small, almost mechanical act by a young man named Jim, but it had changed her world. It had turned the concept of enemy into a question mark. It had offered the possibility of other endings than those she had been taught to expect. She wanted to believe that moment could be a pivot not only for her, but for all who had been taught to fear. She did not confuse a single good act for the end of history. She knew the world was messy, that soldiers could be kind and cruel, that systems made monsters of people on both sides. Yet she felt, with the same stubbornness that had kept her alive in the cave, that this particular fracture in her armor might be the place from which to rebuild. The camp loomed ahead, tents arrayed like a makeshift city, rows of cots, the white flapping of red crosses. The soldiers unloaded supplies. Medics began to organize triage lines. Children were given syrupy vitamins and blankets. A sign, hand-painted, read, "Civilian Aid" in clumsy English. There was a smell here of cooking stew and antiseptic, and the dust of 1,000 footsteps that had not yet decided where they wanted to land. As Ayumi climbed down from the truck, Jim's hand found hers for a second. It was a brief contact, nothing declared. It was a reminder that human beings arrive at kindness in different ways, through small acts, through the relinquishment of old hatreds, or through the awkward attempt to connect. She squeezed his hand back without thinking, and the gesture felt like an acknowledgement. We are here. We are not monsters today. When they led them into the camp, someone gave Ayui a small paper cup of tea and a blanket stamped with a red cross. It smelled faintly of the sea, perhaps from the blanket's origin, or perhaps it was the ocean of other people's lives washing over her. Keiko took her aside and said gently that there would be questions and patience would be necessary. Sachiko smiled and pressed a small herb bundle into her palm as if it were also a promise. Ayumi sat on a cot and let the world come at her in manageable pieces. Injuries were tended, stories recorded in little notebooks, names written in ink like lifelines back to a future she did not yet own. She learned how to stand each day with an intention that was new and shaky, to participate in living rather than only to evade dying. There were nights still when the old messages hissed like a ghost in her ears. The propaganda had not been a private curse. It had been a social architecture. It would not fall through one act of mercy. There would be neighbors who whispered, politicians who proclaimed, and a populace whose memories of war were complicated and raw. She understood this. She understood the need to hold both gratitude and skepticism together, like two fragile flowers in the same fist. But in those early raw days at the camp, with the smell of iodine and stew and the low murmur of so many lives at once, Ayumi began to learn other terms, that a hand could reach out not to seize, but to steady. That language could be clumsy and still mean care. That a soldier's green eyes could be the color of worry and not rage. And as the sun went down over the tents, she thought again of the rope that had cut into her wrists and the knife that never came. She thought of the moment when, for the first time in months, she had tasted something other than fear. She folded that memory carefully, like a map that might lead to a new place. She did not think yet of forgiveness. She did not have to. She only carried, like the blank check of an uncertain future, the possibility that the story she had been told was incomplete. At the edge of the camp, a small boy pointed to a horizon of ruined roofs and asked, in a language he half understood, whether they would ever return. Ayumi looked at him and could not promise. She could only offer the small consolation she now held like a fragile talisman: a cup of tea, a blanket, and the assurance that someone had cut the rope. The cup of tea trembled in her hands, and, for a beat, Ayumi thought the world might unravel again. The steam rose, a small, foreign mercy. Around her, the camp murmured like an animal that had been wounded and was learning to breathe. Tents stitched themselves into a grid beneath a pallid sun. Men and women whose maps of the world had been torn at the edges moved between them with the mechanical hope of people trying to count their losses and sort their days. Medical tents smelled of iodine and boiled vegetables. A line of cots held the first fragile architecture of post-cave life: bandages, blankets, the crisp rustle of ration wrappers. Captain Reynolds walked that line with the careful cadence of someone who had seen too many ends and wanted, fiercely, to prevent even one more. He asked questions, listened through interpreters, and wrote names with a pen that trembled only once. Sachiko's labor began 2 nights after they arrived. The camp was a poor theater for birth. Canvas walls that shivered when the wind moved, the rusting bones of crates used for tables, the faint drone of a distant generator. But it was also the safest place she had known in months. Men and women circled the small delivery area like a careful congregation. Hannah, who had been 16 when she bandaged ankles in a dark cave, stood at Sachiko's side with a steadiness that belonged to someone who had chosen to stay with the living. She had picked up the under-the-tent lessons the medics offered: how to bind a compress, how to soothe fevered skin, how to hold a hand and count breaths until the world felt less urgent. "It's time," Sachiko whispered in a voice thin with work. She clutched a strip of cloth the way people clutch rosaries. The medic called in what help he could spare. Jim stood in the doorway, shoulders squared, a map of exhaustion in the hollows beneath his eyes. He did not know how to deliver a child, but he had learned to move without getting in the way. When the infant arrived, small, stubborn, red as a persimmon, the tent filled with a soft, astonished noise that sounded oddly like laughter threaded through tears. Hannah wrapped the baby in a blanket and passed her to Sachiko, who held the child as if cupping a flame. They named her Hikari because someone in the tent, Keiko perhaps, whispered the word meaning light. The name was both prayer and claim. In a world that had been taught to expect darkness, they named a thing for brightness. That night, Ayumi walked the perimeter of the camp. The sky had been bright enough during the day to bleach even memory. Now fragments of constellations leapt through the black. She thought of Yuki and the river and the way the water had swallowed a laugh. She thought of the rope and the way the blade had not come. The memory was slick and alive, as startling as the taste of chocolate on her tongue. A soldier smoked at the edge of a cooking fire, his face half lit. He passed the cigarette to her without asking. Such small courtesies had become a new form of language. She accepted and nurtured the ember until it burned like a shared secret. The cigarette comforted nothing, but it made fornicating conversation possible. Short, halting sentences that smoothed the gaps between people. If this part of the story surprises you, if you didn't know civilians were found and cared for like this in pockets of the country, comment, "I didn't know." It is the kind of detail that changes how we imagine whole histories. Days stretched with a new geometry. Routines formed across rations and shifts. The medics divided tasks with military efficiency and human heat. The women learned to queue without collapsing into old panic. The soldiers learned that their irrational terror stories were, in their own way, a kind of armor they had once worn. Keiko began teaching a small, ragged school beneath the flap of a tent, reading by ration pack candlelight, names traced in cramped, shaking hands. She made a practice of asking people to tell one ordinary story each day. What they had eaten the week before the war, a festival they remembered, things that shored up identity in a landscape that seemed intent on erasing it. Hannah proved to be an eager student and a quicker teacher. Under Captain Reynolds's eye, she learned to clean wounds with the merciless neatness of someone who would later stitch a life together from other people's raggedness. She learned the Latin of medicine in clipped phonemes, the names of drugs that tasted like salvation, sulfa, penicillin, and the art of holding a blanket tight enough to be warmth, but not so tight as to be a restraint. In the slow hours between triage and the distribution of blankets, she taught children to draw on scrap paper. Their crude pictures, houses with smoke, boats with flags, people with wide, round smiles, were small altars to a future that refused to be named. Fumiko's knee, which had once been a source of constant pain, responded to the treatments. The medics called it recovery, and it was the first time many of them had uttered that word without apology. Fumiko moved with a careful newness, stretching tendons that had been locked by years of fear. With each small step, she seemed to reclaim a piece of the world that had been denied to her. Noriko, who had been mute for so long she had become part shadow, began to speak one word at a time. Her voice was soft like moss, but each syllable was a stone dropped into the quiet pond of the camp, generating concentric circles that reached others. The soldiers, for their part, were not a single storybook kind. They were men who had slept in foxholes and run on rations and smelled of gun grease and cigarette ash. Some of them were clumsy with kindness. They offered items at the wrong moment, or they said things that jostled old fears. Others sat with the dead and learned how to keep their faces kind. Sarge asked questions with a bluntness born of responsibility. Who had been there? What weapons? Was there any risk of a counter-ambush? He carried the heavy, practical faith of someone who had to translate chaos into lists and then into actions. There were moments of friction, the camp a microcosm of all the human contradictions between repair and suspicion. A man from the village who had kept to himself accused another of collaboration. The accusation flashed like a blade and then cooled. Captain Reynolds intervened gently but with firmness. He explained, through an interpreter, that accusations without evidence could break the fragile peace they were crafting. In time, some tensions eased, others left scars, the way rope left marks on wrists. Private Morrison, Jim, was not a constant hero in mythic light. He was a young man who had a habit of trying to be useful in 1,000 small ways. He once fixed a leaking canteen with sticky paper and a patient smile. He taught a group of children a clumsy English song about trains. He also had nights when he was quiet and haunted, when he traced the seam of his life with numb fingers and did not speak. Ayumi watched him and catalogued him in the manner of someone learning a language. His gestures, his small anxieties, the way he paused before he spoke her name. Ayumi's own life took root in modest, stubborn ways. She learned how to weave a basket out of strips of wood, a skill that returned to her hands like a muscle memory. She traded small favors, teaching Keiko how to patch clothing, receiving in return the comforts of cooked rice and a small insistence that she sit down to eat. She started to keep a list in her head, names, faces, the sound each person made when they laughed. Like a ledger of the living she intended to keep. Each entry was a refusal to let memory be only a catalogue of loss. When letters began to arrive, rudimentary, typed forms that the military facilitated for repatriation, Ayumi watched the clipboard hands that measured who would go where. The camp was under the authority of the occupying forces and international relief agencies, and the bureaucratic machinery, for all its coldness, offered a path forward. Some returned to nearby towns that had been rendered as ruins. Others were flown to larger processing centers. The process was slow and jagged. It required interviews and patience and, above all, trust, placed in systems that had not always been trustworthy. At the camp, Ayumi met a woman who had been an aid worker from a neutral country. She spoke softly, with a careful accent. She explained the options. Temporary shelter in a reception center, repatriation to an address in Tokyo if relatives had survived, or placement with agencies that assisted with migration for those who chose to leave Japan entirely. The last option rested at the edges of Ayumi's thinking like a distant shore she could not yet imagine reaching. Weeks passed. Each turn of the calendar blurred into the next and then sharpened again when a new crisis arrived. An outbreak of influenza in a row of cots, which the medics quelled with feverish administration of sulfa. A rumor of bandits at a nearby road, which turned out to be a group of displaced farmers hunting for food. A thin, ecstatic day when a truck arrived with sacks of rice and the camp broke into a hush so expectant it resembled prayer. Still, the world beyond the tents exerted its gravity. In early September, news reached them. The voice of the emperor transmitted across the ether in a way that made civilians gather around the few radios the soldiers kept. It was the moment the war had been declared ended. August had already burned down into its ashes, and now governments and speeches tried to set the remains in order. People listened with different faces: relief, bewilderment, anger, numbness. Ayumi listened and thought of Yuki, and the listening moment did nothing to resolve the river, but it did reduce some tiny barbed edge of fear. The official end of fighting was a fact. The end of all suffering was not. Repatriation to Tokyo was a study in disorientation. The city they had known was both there and not. Neighborhoods were skeletons. Trains were unreliable. Markets were a patchwork of ad hoc stalls and the occasional miracle of fresh vegetables. Ayumi walked through streets that once carried festival drums and now bore the steady, awkward traffic of rebuilding. She saw the charred outline of places she had loved. At the same time, life persisted. A bakery that had somehow survived opened early and offered stale bread, and a child sold hand-carved toys by a makeshift stall. Returning home was not a universal balm. Some people in the city looked at returnees with sharp suspicion. Whispers followed those who had hidden. Rumors suggested that to have survived might imply compromise, surrender, shame. Ayumi felt the old messages press against her ribs. The propaganda had not evaporated with the bombs. In some neighborhoods, neighbors treated returnees with the brittle politeness of people who had learned to measure their words carefully. Ayumi found the house her family had once owned reduced to a shell. There were belongings, scattered and ruined, and she spent the first days sorting through charred fabric and a box of coins that had somehow survived. The ritual of sorting things became a ritual of remembering. A child's shoe, a torn festival ribbon, a photograph, in which Yuki's laugh looked like a sun flare. She sat on a heap and let the pieces of her past be what they were, some salvageable, some not. Jobs were scarce. and many like her clung to whatever work they could find. Ayumi found a position at a small cooperative that distributed supplies to neighborhoods, helping by reading ration tickets and organizing deliveries. It was not noble, but it allowed her a roof and the steady friction of work that keeps ghosts at bay. Keiko stayed in the community and became a kind of local teacher again, organizing classes for children and adults who wanted to relearn reading and arithmetic. Hannah, with hands that had learned the language of medicine, became an apprentice nurse at a municipal clinic, and the look on her face whenever she cleaned a wound suggested a vocation that had little to do with heroics and everything to do with a daily labor of repair. The city itself was a palimpsest. Banners hung in some places calling for reconstruction. In others, people had turned back to the routines of living, cooking, scolding children, making small bargains to survive. Ayumi watched and learned that the end of war did not magically translate into a shared calm. Social resentments simmered. Political waves rose and could be cruel. She kept a careful distance from grand narratives and focused on concrete things: food, shelter, the steady claim of a job. It was in Tokyo that the possibility of leaving the country arrived in her life as an option rather than a fantasy. Aid organizations and resettlement programs were facilitating the migration of some Japanese civilians to distant places where labor was needed, and where, after chaos settled, a new life might be possible. People, exhausted, hopeful, frightened, considered it. For some, it promised relief from the social stigma that followed returnees. For others, it promised a chance to plant roots where the soil had not been scorched by war. Ayumi listened to those conversations with a sense of a horizon she had been pushed to look at and then pulled away from. Jim's unit was rotated back to ship points in late 1945. Before leaving Japan, he found Ayumi, not as some scripted romance, but as someone who had moved from the periphery of his days into a steady presence. They spoke awkwardly and with deliberate slowness. He asked about her plans. She answered with a kind of caution that had become her armor. He told her, without theatricality, that sometimes soldiers could be stationed in other places. Sometimes they could write. Sometimes, if circumstances allowed, they could, well, he did not finish the thought because he was a practical man who found it hard to tell stories without proof. They said goodbye at the dock where the ships were crowded and smells of coal and salt made people more honest. Jim folded his hands around a piece of paper, an address in San Francisco that belonged to a friend of a friend. He gave it to Ayumi with a kind of practical tenderness. "If you ever want to find your way here." The phrase was impossibly fragile, and also oddly insistently real. She kept the paper like a talisman in the years after, folded in a corner of a trunk, smoothed each time she worried. Years moved with a new momentum. Ayumi kept working, saving, measuring every coin. She sent what she could to Keiko and to Hannah, who, in time, became a nurse in a larger clinic and began to send back small, careful reports about the community's slow improvements. Sachiko raised Hikari with an intensity that was sometimes fierce and sometimes tender. The child grew into a curious thing who loved drawing and asking about ships. Fumiko became a volunteer in the local clinic once her knee was sufficiently strong. Her limp diminished like a scar that no longer hurt. The choice to leave was not made lightly. Emigration required documents, conversations, the willingness to step into an unknown that was not simply foreign in geography, but foreign in language, habit, in the very grammar of daily life. Ayumi sought counsel from Keiko and from others. She weighed the betrayal some would whisper as much as she weighed the chance for a life where children might not be taught fear in such blunt, formal ways. In 1949, with a collection of papers and a small savings she had argued for tooth and nail, Ayumi boarded a ship bound for San Francisco. Migration was a long, grinding process. Forms, waits, the subtle humiliation of proving you were worthy of a new country's restraining generosity. On the boat, the night smelled of salt and engine oil. She watched the spray and thought of the river that had taken Yuki, and of the many rivers that could be crossed when a person decided to move. The sea felt like a question that she answered with a step forward. San Francisco was a loud city. Trams and markets and a chorus of languages. Ayumi arrived with a small trunk of clothes, the paper address Jim had once handed her, and a heart that was both aching and insistently curious. The city's immigrant neighborhoods held people who also carried other homelands under their tongues, and this made for an odd kind of fellowship. People traded information: where to find work, which landlord to avoid, where there was a temple that welcomed new arrivals. Ayumi learned to translate her days into English phrases that were blunt but serviceable. She found work in a laundry and later in a small eatery that catered to a mixed clientele. She cooked, learned to bargain, and slowly let the consonants and vowels of a foreign tongue settle in the back of her mouth. Jim, as fate and practical networks allowed, reached out. The address on the paper had been used. He had returned to San Francisco and, with the respectful patience of an adult who had been hardened by war but softened by human ties, he sought her out. They met in a small park near the water. He had aged by a few years in the way men on the front did, the eyes quieter, the hands steadier. He was not a savior or a legend. He was, once again, a man who made pies at a Sunday bake sale, and who could translate "How are you?" into a hand squeeze and a look that said, "I have come to bear witness." Their relationship did not bloom like a romantic fairy tale. It grew in the practical rhythms of shared work and shared small mercies. Jim and Ayumi built a life that was as much about navigating rental contracts and school enrollment as it was about recordings of nostalgic songs from home. They married quietly with a few friends present. Keiko had come from Japan for the ceremony, and Hannah, already a nurse in a nearby city, sent a letter that arrived smelling faintly of starch. The wedding was not the erasure of past sorrows. It was a new page in a life that remained marked by what had happened. They had no illusion that it would make everything right, but it made a commitment to keep living, to keep being present. Children came. They were raised in 2 languages, on rice and on apple pie. They were taught the story of a rope and of water and chocolate because their parents wanted them to know that life contains moments of unexpected tenderness and that hate is taught, not given. Ayumi watched her children learn to navigate identity in a country that sometimes welcomed them and sometimes did not. Their bicultural existence taught them resilience and, sometimes, confusion. Questions about belonging were answered with patience and with stories of Tokyo and of a cave and of a young soldier who knelt to cut a rope. Throughout the years, Ayumi visited Japan when she could. The trips were pilgrimages of a kind, returning to the hillside where shiitake grew, to the ruined shrine that had been rebuilt with careful hands, to the graves of those who had not made it. She would kneel sometimes at a river and lay a small bouquet of wildflowers. She never took these visits as absolution. They were, instead, acts of tending. In old age, she became a quiet keeper of stories, not the loud historian, but a teller who preferred low, precise truths. The way rumor can spread, how propaganda can harden normal people into instruments of fear, how small acts of kindness, water, chocolate, a hand that cuts rope, can alter destinies. She would say to anyone who would listen that she did not view the men who had rescued her as monsters in uniform, nor as saints. They were people, complicated and fallible, and their kindness did not erase other men's crimes. Understanding, she would say, is not the same as forgetting. Her relationship with Jim grew into a companionate steadfastness that had room for both grief and laughter. There were times when they argued about the withholding of emotion, about what to tell their children, about whether it was better to remember the past in full or to keep its most painful edges in a safe box. Jim, who had learned to be practical in war, became a careful husband, fixing leaks, reminding her to call Keiko, bringing home odd treats that overseas supply lines made available. Together, they navigated the complexities of belonging in a new land, the micro-assaults of prejudice, the bureaucratic coldness of immigration offices, the small joys of a child learning to read both kanji and cursive. In the elder years, Ayumi sometimes visited a veterans hall with Jim. He had friends from his unit who would speak in soft, embarrassed ways about what they had done and what they had seen. There were dinners where the food was bad and conversations were better. When she listened, she found men who had been taught one story and had, in the rush of encounters, had their stories complicated. She also found quiet remembrances of the things soldiers had witnessed that could not be easily folded back into ordinary conversation. Back in Japan, the women from the cave fared in different ways. Keiko remained a teacher and a community anchor. Hannah became a respected nurse who trained others, and who, in time, visited San Francisco to see Hikari and other children she had come to know through correspondence. Sachiko raised Hikari with a stubborn tenderness, and in letters she would write of the child's small, luminous achievements, how she drew trains, how she learned to balance a bowl on her head. Fumiko lived long enough to see her neighborhood re-knit itself into a quieter place. Her knee was never the same, but she walked with pride and with the satisfaction of a life leaned into. The climb back to normalcy was neither linear nor total. People held on to memories that would not be reconciled. There were nights when Ayumi woke with the sensation of rope around her wrists and the phantom smell of smoke in her hair. There were strangers who asked blunt questions about loyalty and shame. There were political moments in which national rhetoric hardened and in which it was hard to be gentle with anyone. Through all of that, Ayumi kept a private ledger, not of rights and wrongs, but of what she had seen with her own eyes. She believed in telling that truth, because she had learned that stories heal best when they are real and stubborn to their bones. The moment that had once felt like a possible end, the moment she thought they'd kill her, remained central, not as a miraculous absolution, but as a hinge. It was, in her telling, the small action that stopped a script of violence from completing itself. The soldier's blade had cut rope instead of bodies. The chocolate had been an ordinary ration turned into an extraordinary promise. Those small gestures cracked the surface of every narrative that had taught a people to hate as a form of safety. That is the pivot she returned to in memory and in speech, not to acclaim a simplistic goodness, but to mark the precise instant when her expectation of death met with an unexpected hand and was altered. In public talks she gave, which were modest affairs at community centers and at small libraries, she insisted on nuance. "I do not forgive because I have forgotten," she would say. "I forgive because I learned a different truth. Understanding replaced the black and white picture I was given as a child. It did not take away the loss." Her audiences, often a mix of immigrants and younger students, listened in folds of silence. Sometimes they asked for concrete moral lessons. She demurred. Her lesson was simple and stubborn. Knowing the other reduces the monstrousness we are taught to see, but knowing does not erase pain. On a late autumn afternoon, decades after the rope had been cut, Ayumi returned to the slope outside the village where she used to pick shiitake. The old path had been cleared and mended by neighbors. She walked slowly with Jim at her side, careful not to overburden her knees. The air smelled of damp earth and pine resin. At the crest, where a stone marked the memory of a festival now long gone, she knelt and set a small bouquet of persimmon blossoms in the grass. The act was not a theatrical redemption. It was instead a small, private ritual. She bowed, and she breathed, and she let the moment be what it was, both an ending and a continuation. Her grandchildren, bilingual, impatient, loving, asked questions that sometimes startled her by their directness. One of them, a boy with Jim's green eyes, once said on a visit, "Grandma, were they really monsters?" She smiled at the echo of a childhood propaganda that had lodged in language and, gently, told him the truth, that people could be trained to hate, but they could also be trained to care. "We were taught one story," she said, "then we learned another." In the last years of her life, Ayumi cultivated small acts of repair. She took part in intergenerational programs that connected young Americans with Japanese elders. She wrote, in fits and starts, a notebook of memories, factual, tender, precise, that she hoped would be read not as a black and white parable, but as a human record. She insisted that the nuance be kept, that wrongdoing not be erased, that acts of kindness not be made into facile counters to systemic violence. When she told the story of the rope in public, she always returned to a single idea: that the one act had not magically changed the world, but had changed one life in a manner that allowed more life to follow. In that way, the moment she thought they'd kill her became a hinge in the small moral universe she inhabited, a place where a person could choose, in spite of everything, to accept the evidence that people are complicated, and that human bonds can be forged even in the aftermath of the most violent lessons. She died in a house that smelled of rice and lemon oil, surrounded by the soft argument of family. Voices in 2 languages, plates clinking, a radio murmuring an old song from Japan. Jim held her hand in a gesture that had become ordinary in its devotion. Her last coherent words were not a flourish, but a simple instruction. "Tell the truth," she said, and then, softer, "and be kind." Afterward, her family gathered pieces of memory and arranged them so the story would not blur. They read her notebook and learned her precise account of the cave, of the rope, of chocolate and water, and the green eyes of a young soldier who cut a knot instead of striking a body. They inherited not only belongings, but a way of seeing: that human life resists simplification, that history is messy and personal, and that a single compassionate act can pivot destiny. The rope had left a pale line around her wrists in memory. The mark remained as proof that sometimes what seemed like an end could become, instead, a door. She had kept living in the space beyond that door, sometimes full of fear, sometimes full of laughter, but always attentive to the way stories shape the world. The moment she had thought they'd kill her did not absolve her past, nor did it solve all the world's cruelties. It did something quieter. It gave her an alternative narrative. The enemy could be monster or neighbor. The truth depended on whom you met and what hands reached toward you. For Ayumi, a hand reached out and cut a rope. That hand did not erase grief, but it opened a possibility, a small, stubborn possibility that made rebuilding a life not merely an act of survival, but an act of witness. If this story moved you, if it reshaped how you think about civilians and wartime and the fragile power of small acts, subscribe for more untold human histories. There are many moments like Ayumi's, hidden pivots of mercy and choice that ask to be remembered.